We can look at performance-related non-technical skill assessment in a number of different ways. For us, because there's so much to it, it's sometimes easier to create categories of performance, and so we identify cognitive capabilities and thinking preference as a category, motivation as another one, concentration skills, productivity traits, communication skills, interpersonal skills, and emotional intelligence, all as our base performance categories. And then we can move, depending on the situation, into managerial capability and leadership capability as well. Within these categories, we'll have subcategories. So, for example, within productivity traits, we may have decision making. And within decision making, we would have various components that would make up the decision making process. So we can go fairly deep, and that's important to be able to identify potential root causes in performance issues, and then also be able to maintain our focus on the overall client objectives. So in our first chart, I wanted to show you some average scores. And so these are scores for 5 team members. They're the average scores. And we can see, based on our criteria, how our team in accumulated results have fared. Now that said, we have to be careful of putting too much reliance on average scores, because I'm a big believer that performance needs to be individualized as much as possible. And so any developmental programs or whatever, there could be instances where the team would benefit as a whole, but it's very likely the case that there are individuals within the team that may benefit from certain performance development programs than others. Anyways, in this case, we're looking at some general concepts related to performance capability, and our first one is characteristic that we're measuring is information processing capability, otherwise referred to as multitasking. And in this case, we can see that our team is fairly good at it. The important thing to remember about multitasking is not how many tasks you take on, but it's how many that you can actually do well. There's no sense taking on a lot of tasks and then failing at half of them. So in that respect, our team isn't bad. Our next category is behavior control, and this is the ability of people to maintain their composure in the workplace. It can also be an indication of a willingness to take risk, and our score here is less of a risk-taking group. They would tend more to have composure and be able to control their behavior in the workplace. Our next characteristic is control, and that's the desire in a person to take control over events or people. And again, we're positive on that score. Our team members seem to be pretty good. The next category is performance-related self-confidence, and we seem to be very good at that as well. We then look at competitiveness, and we can see that we're not overly competitive as a group, but there is an element of it. Our next score is related to decision-making speed, and this is how fast our team would make decisions. In this case, they're a little faster than the general population, but not overly so on average. And then our next characteristic is related to self-criticism, and here our people are not overly hard on themselves. And here we're looking at a couple of things. This one scores negatively, so this is actually low self-criticism, whereas up here we would be concerned. But because our people are not overly hard on themselves, there's a degree of healthy self-criticism. We just want to be careful if we see the scores go too low, because in that case, then people may have this feeling that they can do no wrong and that everything that they do is right. Our next score relates to focus over time, and this is the ability of our people to maintain focus on a task for extended periods of time. And our final score relates to performance under pressure and how well our people will perform when the pressure is on and they're under stress. Finally, what I'd like to mention is that these are decent scores, and that's fine, but we want to be careful about seeing extreme scores. So when we see something like extreme self-confidence and extreme self-confidence and extreme control, those people can often be resistant to input, and if they're very detail-oriented, can tend to be micromanagers. So like anything else, a suitable amount of a characteristic is preferred. We don't particularly want to see extremes in most situations. Similarly, if we look at competitiveness, extreme competitiveness can be good in some situations, but it can be off-putting for other team members if one of the members is overly competitive and the others aren't. So again, it's all in relative terms to the work that you're doing and the interactions and how you're dealing with other team members. But at least what we can take from this is an overall idea of the team's capabilities and these characteristics. Again, I don't think I'd go so far as to say, well, we really need to increase any one area. You know, you might say, well, we might want to encourage competitiveness if that's what's required in the workplace. But we don't know at this stage if there's anything that on a team-wide basis would be particularly helpful for performance. So we get a different picture when we look at the same information in a different way. Now on this chart, you can see that we have now split into the 5 team members, member A, B, C, D, and E, and we now can show their individual scores on each of these categories. We still have our average scores, which is the blue line with the red numbers, and then our individual scores to the right. So when we look at information processing, we can see that generally the team is okay, but candidates B and candidate E are significantly better at multitasking and processing vast amounts of information than is candidate D. Similarly, the scores on behavior control are still positive for everybody, but candidate A is going to be much better at controlling their behavior in the workplace than would be candidate C. Although candidate C is still going to be pretty good. We would be more concerned if they were way down in this area. Need for control, which is often very important to management and leadership, we can see that candidate C certainly sticks out from the rest of the pack. So C and candidate E's are both very much interested in taking control of situations and people. Lesser so for candidate B, and candidates A and D are not particularly interested in being the boss or being the leader or whatever taking control would be. So again, even though our average score tends to show that the team is high, the team is very different in how they approach control. Self-confidence. Again, we had an original high score on our average scores, and our 3 members here, B, C, and E, are very much self-confident when it comes to their performance, but we might want to do a little bit of work with candidates A and candidates D to help bring them up in their self-confidence in relation to their other team members. Also, when we look at competitiveness, we can see that candidate C is relatively uncompetitive when they're compared to the other groups or members of the team. Decision-making speed is interesting. Everybody's relatively the same, except candidate B certainly stands out, and so that's fine. They are going to take decisions faster than other people. They're going to be very self-confident in taking their decisions. They're going to be able to take decisions based on a wide range of information, but we need to also be careful that they're taking decisions that are right and that are effective, not just taking the wrong decisions faster. When we're looking at our degree of self-criticism, again, we're relatively similar on that, but candidate E does stand out a little bit from the pack, and as I mentioned before, we need to be careful that candidate E does not think that they're right and all the time, and is still open to not only personal evaluation, but to input from other people around them as to their performance. Focus over time as a group, generally not bad. Candidate E stands out, but we would get a little bit concerned about candidate D and being able to maintain a level of focus similar to what their other team members can handle. And finally, performance under pressure, we can see that candidate C stands out, and candidate B and E are fairly strong, and above our average line, but candidates A and D could fall down when under high pressure situations. Now, again, that's not terrible scores, but in comparison to the other ones, we can see that they're going to be less able to handle it. What I also want to mention is we don't want to get too hung up on the individual numbers. Is there a big difference between a 53 score and a 46 score? Perhaps not, but at least it makes us aware of the differences. And in this case, the average line becomes more relevant in that we can see how each team member compares to the average score of the team together. So, like anything else, it all has to be taken with a grain of salt, but it provides us better information to identify on an individual basis or on team members, certain members of the team, and perhaps in some cases all members of the team, where we should perhaps focus our developmental activities. In this chart, we're showing team averages again. And here we're looking at some overall performance characteristics. The first being our team's interest in success. And here we see a fairly high score, which is good to see. Then we see a general score for overall productivity that then would be later broken down into various components or subcategories. We see our team's general level of persistence, their willingness to stay with something. It's a little different than focus over time, which is more devoted to a task, whereas persistence is the ability to keep going despite setbacks and undesirable results. Then we move into decision making. Again, this is not decision making speed, but their overall proficiency at making decisions, which is going to be made up of a number of components in the decision making process. We move on to team management, otherwise known to me as team membership. I think that people who are generally good at managing a team are good members in themselves. They understand all the implications of team membership, and we'll look at that in more detail as well. We look at some overall communication skills, which we will again break down into various components. Listening skills, which is very important, especially from a managerial and leadership perspective. And then finally, communication feedback. And there's a reason that's more of a specialized assessment, but there's a reason that I included that one as well. And I wanted to perhaps talk about that later in the presentation. From this, we can say, as a team, should we then investigate whether we should do something relative to overall listening skills? That would be the first thing that would stand out. And we might explore whether there's a need for work in communications, work in decision making, making a more effective decision making process for the members, and overall productivity. Again, this is a broad overview. We don't want to read too much into it until we get to the next more detailed comparison. Again, as we move from the average score on the previous charts to a more detailed chart, we get a greater perspective on the differences between the team members. We still have our average scores in the blue bar with the red numbers on the left, and then our team members to the right. Immediately what we notice is team member E scored consistently higher than the other team members on all of these characteristics. Team member C was scoring high as well, but from a performance standpoint, team member D consistently scored lower than the other team members, and this could be an indicator of a need to develop some sort of performance program for team member D. As well, when we look at listening skills, which we identified as a perhaps area for development, we can see that of the 5 members, that really 3 would benefit from some sort of coaching or program in listening skills, and that it may not be as helpful to team member C and team members E. That being said, everybody can always benefit from developmental programs. It's just if there were priorities, it would be to identify the people most in need and then to focus on them first. Similarly, when we look at productivity traits, the team in general is not that bad in productivity. However, there may be some benefit in programs or coaching, performance coaching, to be provided to team member D. Across the board, our scores aren't bad. Again, we don't want to just focus on bringing people up to the average. I think that we should always focus on bringing everybody to higher levels of performance. But at the same time, we need to identify relative need and who's most going to benefit from any developmental programs. Rather than just doing across the board work all the time. I mean, we need to determine whether that's going to be beneficial or not, or to identify specific areas to develop or specific people that would best benefit from developmental programs.